clearance of the territories contaminated by these munitions.
I see no objections. The convention is adopted.
Evidence has shown that even with forces that have the best legal backup, with legal officers present at every level of command, with all these safeguards in place, and with very effective education in IHL, that these forces have had major problems with the use of cluster munitions.
The problem with clusters is that they don't all go off. So sometimes they fail. Some weapons, the failure rate is higher than others. These weapons that we used here are quite old.
It's bad enough that civilians are caught up in the fighting and suffer incredible pain, disruption, displacement during the conflict. But it's, to us, absolutely repugnant that this killing and injuring of civilians would go on for years or decades simply because of the choice of the wrong weapon in an armed conflict. A cluster munition is a container which contains small individual submunitions. Now, some of these containers may include a few, 5, 10, but it may include as many as 650 individual submunitions. These can be distributed by artillery fire from the ground, from missiles, from aircraft, and when in flight they will open, the container will open and distribute these hundreds and hundreds of small submunitions, which are intended to create a devastating force over a very large area, up to tens of thousands of square meters.
This building's been hit by cluster munitions. The main force went through the roof, and then the fragmentation, as you can see, it's scattered up against the wall. They have two effects. They're what they call dual purpose. This one, if it hits a vehicle, it's got enough power to go through the armour skin of a vehicle. But also, it's designed to create fragmentation. So if you've got troops in the area, then the vehicle is damaged or disabled or destroyed, and the troops or the people around it, obviously there's a chance that they're going to get hit by the fragmentation.
The problem is the volume. These can be delivered in the hundreds and hundreds of thousands in a few hours, in millions in a few days. And these numbers, combined with the fact that from 10 to 40% simply don't explode, create a huge problem of contamination and a huge threat to civilian populations.
What we have here is an M85 cluster munition, and as you can see, it's with the self-destruct mechanism, which means this shouldn't exist, and this should be blown to pieces. But this site doesn't just contain one, and I find yet another, and as you can see by the arming hammer, it is most definitely armed and definitely dangerous.
These are weapons which were designed for use in the Cold War against massive numbers of tanks on an open battlefield, basically in Central Europe. Well, that war never happened. These are being used in mainly developing countries around the world.
Very quickly after the Kosovo conflict, the major killer of civilians was not anti-personnel mines or anti-vehicle mines or conventional munitions, but these munitions.
عنقودي ملان عنقودي هون.
إنه كتير حاجة شفنا منها.
It showed us really the worst case scenario of what can happen when cluster munitions are used on a massive scale and in a variety of environments. For instance, they were used in populated areas, in or near populated areas. They were used in agricultural areas. So basically, it showed what the future holds if this problem is not dealt with urgently.
The stories we collect about cluster munition victims, when I say victim, I speak of the person individually affected, but also the family and the community, are absolutely horrendous. These are stories of families where the dad has been beheaded by a submunition, where sometimes 1, 2 children have been killed.
People come back to their homes, even if they weren't there at the time of the bombing. They come back to their homes, they see the rubble, they try to enter. Often cluster munitions are mixed into the rubble. They may be found accidentally, or people may see them and try to get rid of them.
The effect of the landmines or the submunitions is terrible. It's really destroying your life, affecting your life forever. And the fact that most of the victims are men, are male, potentially breadwinners in a family, it's a disaster.
You cannot expect a civilian population to be expert in the nature of all types of munitions. And the more munitions of this nature which are left lying around, the greater the dangers are.
Pi thua chọc, tua pi mana, tua pi, tua hấp nhung bắt đầu, nhung trào ấy, nhung là bột cái bắt chỗ, cái trái bột tua pi.
If cluster munitions are littering a landscape, an agricultural landscape, for example, it can be devastating for the livelihoods of individuals who depend on those fields or orchards for their livelihoods, or they will simply find that it's essential for them to continue engaging in risky behavior by going in, trying to clear them and trying to use that land. But in either case, there's a loss to the individual and to the community.
هذا رزق عزيز، رزق عزيز، موسم. والأرض هيدي موسم، يعني هلأ أنا حاسس حالي مكتب ومخنوق، ما قادر أتحرك، ما قادر أتحرك بالمرة. هلأ شو العمل مش عارف.
When designers design and test weapons, they do so usually under rather ideal conditions. They are intended to hit a hard military object or a runway or a paved road or a vehicle, and so they test them against such objects. Now, when they're used in the real world, they hit all kinds of objects. They may become entangled in trees. They may go into a muddy marsh. They may go into a hillside covered with snow. And so the impact is not necessarily great enough to detonate them. There's a problem of aging, that these systems are just becoming older and older and can't be expected to work. There's the problem of how they're used. Sometimes in the heat of battle, they may be released at the wrong altitude, at the wrong airspeed, at the wrong angle of attack.
From a technical point of view, it's difficult to see how one could guarantee a very high reliability rate during active service conditions and all the factors that will impinge on these weapons when they're in use. Another problem is the wide footprint of many of these weapons at time of impact, so that it's more likely that civilians will get caught up in a strike at time of use.
These are area weapons. They will destroy everything in a given area. And if this given area is in or near a populated area where people are living, it's very hard to see how you can use these in accordance with the rules of discrimination and proportionality.
All these factors create a very complicated situation for a commander who, under the pressure of battle, in the heat of battle, is trying to make a decision as to whether he engages a particular target or not. He may have legal advice, he may have not, but nonetheless, it's a very complex calculus to make.
How can you judge the proportionality of the attack if you don't know how many of your weapons will fail to function? How do you judge the proportionality of an attack if you don't know how much damage you'll do to the civilian population in the near term or in the long term because of unexploded munitions lying around on the ground? Because of the characteristics of most existing cluster munitions, that's to say their inaccuracy and their unreliability, it's not possible to apply international humanitarian law, the basic rules, in a consistent fashion. And for that reason, specific rules to prohibit these kinds of weapons need to be in place.
What the Convention does is it prohibits the manufacture, possession, use, transfer of all cluster munitions.
The treaty is extremely future-proof against development of cluster munitions in their current form, and that was one of the great challenges that we faced. I think we've succeeded in doing that.
If you look at the problems that cluster munitions have created around the world and would continue to create around the world, this convention covers all of those munitions. It also has extremely good provisions on stockpile destruction. Stockpiles have to be destroyed within an 8-year period. It has a provision that requires states that are affected by cluster munitions to remove those cluster munitions, with international assistance, of course, within a period of 10 years. And it creates very, very strong victim assistance provisions as well.
Whether or not the convention is realistic really depends on the level of political will. We've heard a lot of strong talk, a lot of support, but in the end it's going to come down to some real commitment and a lot of resources. It's going to be very expensive to destroy stockpiles. It's going to be very expensive to clear large areas. Yes, I think it's realistic, I think it's achievable, but it will require a good deal of commitment.
What we also need to do with this convention is to stigmatise cluster munitions for those countries that are outside the convention. And that requires getting as many countries to bring it into force, to become party to it as quickly as possible. The reality is, of course, that a convention that has 100 parties to it has a greater stigmatising effect on the weapon than a convention that has 30 countries party to it.
Military people are generally pretty practical. They don't want unreliable or inaccurate munitions. They also don't want to be in a position where they're being forced to use a weapon which is stigmatised internationally. And they don't want to be accused of disobeying international humanitarian law.
There's a military utility for every weapon. There was arguments that chemical weapons have a military role. This went on for decades, but in the end, the politicians have to decide that some weapons are beyond the pale. They have to decide that the human cost of using those weapons, of allowing them to be used, is too high, and they have to be prohibited or restricted on that basis. And that's what international humanitarian law is all about.